Cross-text connections are essentially the new version of paired passages from the old reading exam. In that case, we only had one paired passage per exam. Here, you're only going to have one cross-text connection problem per exam at most. So you might want to consider that as you think about how much time you want to devote to this particular prompt. Like the old pair passages, in this case you have two texts, text 1, text 2. They're only short paragraphs and you have to analyze them. In most cases, there's always a question on the old exam about how the one passage relates to the other. What would author 2 say about author 1's passage in general? And that prompt exists again on the new exam, and usually it was opposition. They disagreed with each other. That's actually still true on the new exam. They're mostly in opposition. And then there was a more narrowed version. How would author 2 respond to a specific quote from text 1? And in this case, we're going to have an underlined form of the question. How would the author of text 2 respond to the underlined sentence in text 1? And we'll take a look at both examples to get a sense of how they each work. Moreover, there was another question that was sort of a minor point question in that, for example, if they two passages disagreed or were in opposition, the minor point question would be, what would the authors agree on? It would never be the main idea because they disagreed on that. It would always be some weird minor point that, really wasn't, something as opinionated as the main idea, and it certainly wasn't the main idea. So we're going to take a look at those examples, which still exist on the new version of the exam. With that, let's take a look at some examples. And we're going to start with the idea that as we read this, we're going to work it just like we do other reading sections, whether it's command of evidence, inference, main idea, etc. We want to read to get the idea of the text. And in this case, you really want to dumb it down. You want to reduce it to a simple logical statement. Dogs, good. Cats, bad. And then resolve the logic and the conditions of the question from there. Don't try to overcomplicate it. Simplify it and then move on. That really helps. And once we do that, we want to predict the answer and use that to help us find the matching answer. So let's go ahead and begin with an example. Okay, I've got a cross-text connection or a paired passage. And the first thing I want to do is I want to read exactly what the question is asking, because there are a couple different presentations. In this case, Singh and Roy, text 2, most likely respond to the research discussed in text 1. So basically I want the broad idea of text 2, what they would think of text 1. Public policy researcher Anthony Fowle studied the history of elections on Australia, a country that requires citizens to vote. So they're required to vote. You don't just sign up like you do in the United States. Fowler argues that requiring citizens to vote leads to a significant increase in voters who would otherwise not have time or motivation to vote. So this is the claim. Thus, election results in countries that require citizens to vote better reflect the preferences of the country as a whole. Okay, so what would text 2 say? Governments of democratic countries function better when more people vote. Okay, this is an agreement so far. Okay, we agree. However, forcing people to vote may have negative consequences. Singh and Roy studied what happens when a country requires its citizens to vote. They found that when people feel forced to vote, they tend to spend less time looking for information about their choices when voting. As a result, votes from these voters may not reflect their actual preferences. Okay, so what would the authors of text 2 say about 1? Well, it's good that people vote, but when you force them to vote, their actual preferences may not be represented at all. So A, only countries of a certain population size, nothing about population size. Okay. B, people who are forced to vote are likely to become politically engaged in other ways. Well, it didn't say they get engaged other ways politically, right? It just simply said it does not reflect their preferences. So this is not in there. And by the way, it never says anything about volunteering or running for office. So A and B are not correct. C, requiring people to vote does not necessarily lead to election outcomes that better represent the preferences of the country as a whole. Text 1 did say that when everybody votes, it better reflects the preferences of the country as a whole. That was part of the claim. Text 2 says when people are required to vote, they may not vote based on their actual preference, which blows up the conclusion of text 1 that the country as a whole, their preferences are better reflected. No, that wouldn't be the case. So C would be the right answer. Requiring people to vote does not necessarily lead to election outcomes that better represent the preferences of the country as a whole, the claim from text 1. That's what text 2 would say. D, countries that require voting must also make the process of voting easier for their citizen. That's just a classic wrong answer choice where there's no evidence in the passage to suggest that. Okay, in this paired passage problem, we actually want to know what text 2 would say about the interpretation in the underlined portion of text 1. So there I see the underlined portion right there. And I might be able to get away with just reading that and then reading 2. That might be enough to set up the conditions to answer the problem. But I still like reading the whole thing, even if it's pretty quickly, just to get the idea. So historians studying pre-Inca Peru have looked at ceramic vessels to understand daily life among the Moche people. These mold-made sculptures present plants, animals, and human faces in precise ways. Vessels representing human faces are so detailed that scholars have interpreted facial markings to represent scars and other skin irregularities. Whoa, so they're basically saying they were so detailed that they actually could put in on the sculptures a person's scars or something weird about their skin. That's pretty amazing. Let's see what text 2 says. I'm sure they're going to doubt that. Art 2 archaeologist Trevor has argued the interpretation of Moche portrait vessels as hyper-realistic portrayals of identifiable people, this was text 1, the underlined portions idea, may inadvertently disregard the creativity of the object's creators. So basically saying they're being misinterpreted. There's something wrong with the assessment that these are actually facial markings, scars, things like that. Trevor argues artworks in which sculptors could free their imagination using realistic objects and people around them as inspiration. So simple idea is their text 1 underlined portion says very detailed, shows scars and other facial markings. Text 2 says, nope, that's really not quite right. It was more a creative imagination that the artist went with and ran with, not necessarily a realistic interpretation. So text 1 underlined wrong. All right, that's good. Now I understand the ideas in a very sort of simplified fashion. Let's go find the answer. What would 2 say? Depictions of human faces are significantly more realistic than plants. No, it's not plants versus human faces. Wrong ideas, mixing concepts. B, it is likely that some depictions of human faces with extensive markings are intended to portray the same historical individual. What? The same? Where are we talking about the same up above? That's not right. C, some vessels may have been damaged during their excavation, provide little insight. Well, okay, that's completely irrelevant to the idea. Again, the idea is that this hyper-realistic presentation from text 1 underline probably isn't right, according to text 2. D, markings on depictions of human faces that are not necessarily intended to portray particular details about the physical appearance. Right, they're not. They're actually a marking or an indicator of the creativity of the actual artist who created them. They're using realistic objects to express their imagination, to explore abstract concepts, as it says there. D is the right answer. It's the right idea. So that's how we do it. We simplify the idea, we use that to predict our answer, and then we check all the answer choices using our various elimination techniques to answer it, just like we would most any reading question. Okay, I have a paired passage. As always, I read the question first. Both authors would most likely agree with which statement. Okay, so this is a special presentation of the text connections or paired passages where the authors agree with each other. And that usually appears when the actual passages were in opposition to each other. This would be a minor idea question prompt. What would they agree on? Not the main idea where they disagree, but what would they agree on? Or likewise, if they somehow agreed, then the question would be, well, what would they disagree on? So here, I think we have that here in our prompt. So how do we approach that? Let's again read the text, simplify down the ideas. Dance choreographer Alvin Ailey deeply admired jazz music, most clearly felt in the rhythms and beats his works were set to. He collaborated with some of the greatest jazz legends. With his choice of music, Ailey helped bring jazz to life for his audience. So he loved jazz. He clearly was felt in the rhythms and beats of his work. That was a big part of it, I guess. So rhythms and beats, and he just loves jazz. Jazz good. Okay. Text 2. Jazz is present throughout Ailey's work, but it's most visible in Ailey's approach to choreography, so dancing, right? Up here it said rhythms, beats were the big part. Here we say the big part is choreography. So it's a little different. Ailey often incorporated improvisation, a signature characteristic of jazz, in his work of managing dance company. He rarely forced his dancers to an exact set of specific moves. Instead, he encourages dancers to let their own skills and experiences shape their performance, as jazz musicians do. So main idea, rhythms and beats. Text 1 says big part of Alvin Ailey. Text 2 says no, choreography, his dance moves and how the dancers worked. That's the biggest part of his work. Okay, so but we want something, and of course they disagree, which is typical, but we want what would they agree with? Well, what they agree with is in either case, Alvin Ailey was a jazz legend, it looks like, right? So it says, characters jazz music, he encouraged the dance listeners. They both seem to say he is using jazz, and that's a big part of his work, right? Number 2 doesn't really say he is famous and a legend. Number 1 does, so I wouldn't say that's the same between them or an agreement. But I think an agreement is that he uses jazz. So let's see the answers. Dancers who worked with Ailey greatly appreciated his supportive approaches. No, I don't know what dancers appreciated, right? That's a typical wrong answer. I can't get into the head or mind of a dancer, so that's not right. Ailey's work was strongly influenced by jazz. There we go. Yes. Whether it's the rhythms of the beats or whether it's the choreography, it is jazz. That's the common factor to all of it. So that's our answer. That's our minor idea. That's the right answer. And that's typically the situation. So it's usually, cats are good pets, dogs are bad pets, but cats and dogs are typical pets in a household. That's a truth that's, separate or a minor idea from the main ideas there. So those are the kind of things you see on these types of prompts. So let's quick check C and D. Audiences were mostly unfamiliar. I don't know if audiences were familiar or any unfamiliar any more than I know if anybody who worked with him appreciated his approach. Ailey blended multiple genres of music together. No, he used jazz. There's jazz, jazz, jazz up above. No evidence for D.